Tonight's guest is a supervisory museum specialist in the Division of Mammals at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. Previously, he worked at the American Museum of Natural History and led field expeditions throughout the world, collecting specimens in South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. He has named more than a dozen new species of mammals and shed light on hundreds of others. His book tonight is a captivating account of how Theodore Roosevelt's lifelong passion for the natural world set the stage for America's wildlife conservation movement. He is also the author of several books for children. Please join me in welcoming Darrin Lunde.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's really great to be here. I'm going to start with a quote, and this is a quote from Roosevelt in the last decade of his life. And the quote goes, "The country is the place for children, and if not the country, a city small enough so that one can get out into the country." Now, Roosevelt was speaking from the heart when he said this. He grew up in the heart of New York City, a place that was completely devoid of nature. But like all children, he had a natural affinity for animals and for the outdoors. And he expressed that affinity through books. So Roosevelt, it's very well known, he was a sickly child. He suffered from asthma. He had all kinds of health problems. But he was also very precocious, and he learned to read at a very early age. And his father had a great library. He called it a room of gloomy respectability. But he would go down there, and he would bury himself in books. And more than anything, he loved books about animals. Animals and any story about outdoor adventure, especially explorers, people that worked for museums, that went out and collected specimens and described new things, and anything that combined the two. Those were his favorite books. So he very easily, I think, could have settled into the life of this kind of sedentary, indoor, bookish naturalist. And if it weren't for an accidental turn of events, he might have become just that. Think about that. Like, think about if Roosevelt hadn't become a naturalist, we probably wouldn't have national parks. I mean, it's conceivable we wouldn't have any national parks without Roosevelt. But Roosevelt, when he was 8 years old, was wandering up Broadway. Not this Broadway. There's another one in New York. He was wandering up Broadway, 8 years old, and he was passing a grocery store where his parents often sent him to pick out strawberries or get fruits or something or other. And there, splayed out in front of the store on a board, was a seal, an actual seal. It was about this big, and it was probably a harbor seal, which they're not uncommon still in New York. You see them occasionally in the harbor. But someone found this thing dead, and they splayed it out on a board. The idea was to attract paying customers, but boy, did it attract Teddy Roosevelt. And he went right up to it, put his hand on it, and started examining it. From his books, he knew that naturalists kept specimens, that they studied dead animals. And he was just fascinated when he saw this thing. And he asked the shopkeeper, "Can I have it?" No, you can't have it. And so he raced home and he got a notebook and a ruler, and he started writing up a natural history of seals based on that one specimen, 8 years old. And he kept going back day after day. There was something about that seal, something about being able to put your hands on it and look at the teeth and look in the eyes, and he could feel the flippers and he could feel the bones inside. And he admitted, he said, the moment that this is in his autobiography many, many years later, he said, the moment I saw that seal, I knew I had to be a naturalist. That was the precise moment, 8 years old, when Teddy Roosevelt decided that that was going to be his life's vocation. And he took it seriously. It wasn't just a passing fad. And he had a very specific idea of what kind of naturalist he wanted to be. He wanted to be a museum naturalist. He wanted to be, and he had read about these kinds of naturalists. He wanted to collect specimens. And he used that seal. He got it eventually. He didn't get the whole seal. He finally convinced the shopkeeper, probably when it was starting to rot. It's like, here, kid, here, take it away. Gave him the head, carried it home, and somehow managed to clean it. He probably boiled it, cut all the flesh off, and got this nicely clean skull. And he used it to describe what he called, ambitiously, the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. That's a real thing. And he quickly got 12 more specimens, and so it's growing. From that moment on, up until halfway through Harvard, almost every single day, Roosevelt was doing something to contribute to that museum. You could go, he was a prolific writer, he kept lots of diaries, and then there were gaps where he didn't have diaries. You open almost any one of his diaries, chances are, on any given day, he's either collecting something, or like skinning something, or cleaning a bone, and he wasn't doing it for an exhibit. It wasn't that kind of natural history museum. You need to understand that there are museums that you see, which are public displays, and then behind the scenes there are scientific collections, where many, many, many examples of animals are kept for study. That was the kind of museum that Roosevelt wanted to make. And he kept meticulous catalogs, tagged everything, described, everything about the animals that he found. He convinced his parents to give him, well, they didn't give him the lessons. They paid for him to study with one of the best taxidermists of that time, a guy named John Bell, who incidentally was the taxidermist to Audubon. And so John Bell, as a young man, had traveled with Audubon all through what was then the American West. It wasn't quite as far west as our West today, but he traveled all with Audubon and went back to New York and taught taxidermy, and Roosevelt learned taxidermy from him. He learned to shoot guns. Everyone knows Roosevelt was a big game hunter, but he got into guns because he wanted to collect specimens for his museum. This is known. He writes about it. His uncle was a kind of an expert on guns and taught little Teddy at a very early age how to use them. So he was serious, really serious, for a decade. And man, that seal, that really changed him, and it really got his attention and hooked him, and it got my attention too, because I got my start in natural history in almost exactly the same way. So I grew up in New York City, and I remember what it's like having this natural interest, this innate, and I do believe it's innate. I think every child is born with an innate interest in animals and the outdoors. It's theirs to develop or let atrophy. And I remember what it's like having no material around, I remember vacant woodlots, because I grew up not in the nice part of New York City. There were still like vacant little woodlots, behind where I lived. And I remember, those woodlots being destroyed, and I remember that habitat being gone, and I remember all kinds of rats and squirrels and opossums just getting squished on the streets. And so I went out there, roughly the same age as Roosevelt, and dragged these things back home. And like Roosevelt, I had good, understanding parents that allowed me to do this. And I had the exact same experience where I taught myself taxidermy. It's not that hard. It's pretty intuitive, and you could order away for kits, and they explain how to do it. And I got into guns because I wanted to get specimens, and I did have access to rural areas outside of New York City. And the exact same thing happened, where I just naturally developed this interest to build natural history museums. And Everything I collected was cataloged, it had tags, I kept notebooks, I kept journals on everything meticulously. When I went to college, I had about 600 specimens of birds and mammals. They were in snakes and jars of alcohol, and study skins of birds in drawers, and so did Teddy. Teddy collected more than me. He was up around 700 by the time he went to college. But yeah, when I found that out about Teddy, it was kind of a relief, because for the first time I realized that I wasn't weird, that there was someone else that actually did this, and did it as intensively and as passionately as I did. And also, when I found this out about Roosevelt, kind of accidentally and kind of late in life, I realized that I had stumbled upon something that was really important about Roosevelt's personality that not too many people really knew about, and that was his museum naturalism. I knew there was something important there. So our lives were very, very similar right up until the time that we both started college. And I promise I won't equate myself with Roosevelt. Our paths diverged, and he became president and I didn't. And many other things. But up until that time, there was an uncanny connection that I had just reading about Roosevelt and all of these things that he did. I could relate to what he was doing. So when I went to college, I immediately started, because I had all of this experience, I wanted to be exactly this kind of naturalist too, and I wanted to go off on expeditions and work for museums, and I worked for the University Museum, and when I graduated, I immediately got a job with the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And my first job, weeks after graduating, I went down to South America, to the Amazon, for it wasn't all at one time, but ultimately it was 11 months that I spent down there on expeditions. And I've been on expeditions, all over the place. I was at the American Museum for exactly 20 years. And then I moved down to Washington, and now I work for the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian, and I've been there for 6 years. And all through those years, much of my time, when I add it up, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. When you add it up, it's almost 5 years that I've spent like living in jungles, in tents, and in hammocks. I mean, that amount of time. And these aren't tours. There's no tour guide. There's no there's no bus, there's no pamphlet, there's nothing. Our objective is to get into really remote areas. These kinds of expeditions, they still go on, they still take place, and we're the people that do. There's never more than like 100 people worldwide that are engaged in this kind of work. Worked all over, and we do it with guns and with traps. I need to make that clear. I was telling someone we went down to shoot animals. No, we're going down and we're shooting animals, to be clear about that. And the reason for that is you still need a specimen. There are still places on Earth where there are species that haven't been described, and we find them, and we preserve them, and we bring them back, and we describe them. Most of the work that we do now in this regard is very closely tied to conservation work. That wasn't always the case, but it is the case now. I was just explaining before the talk a recent expedition just a few months ago coming back from Kenya, where we're revisiting some of the localities that Roosevelt collected 105 years earlier. So the point that I want to make is that I went on and we're working in places like South Sudan. It's another project we have with Smithsonian where we go in and we find new species of bats, and we describe them, and we test them for Ebola, and we make recommendations to the government, and this is where you need to put your park and not here. This is where the diversity is. So it's all good work, but it's museum work, and it's work that people really don't hear about a lot. Teddy would have killed to be this kind of naturalist. That's exactly what he wanted to be. But something happened when he went to Harvard. He specifically went to Harvard specifically to become an outdoor museum naturalist, to go on these expeditions. But when he got there, he discovered that that kind of biology had temporarily gone out of style. And instead, in its place, was a much more European style. And they wanted naturalists to sit at microscopes, and they wanted them to, cut slides and sections and sit hunched over, little squiggly things from the ocean. And he pounded his fist. You could just almost see him, and just rather famously said, if I can't be the kind of naturalist that I want to be a naturalist like Audubon. And he went through and named all of the prominent naturalists and said, if I can't be a naturalist like that, then I don't want to be a naturalist at all. And he very resolutely and very famously at that moment said that he was going to abandon natural history. And he did, but not really, not at all. Because when you look at the course of his political career, through the New York State Assembly, and he got into politics, New York State Assembly, governor of New York State, vice president of the United States, president of the United States. All through his adult life, he was constantly, when you really just scratch just a little bit below the political surface and you see the naturalist there, and you see how he was in constant communication with the curators at these museums. Look, he got into hunting largely because it was a surrogate for the kind of natural history expeditions that he wanted to engage in, And he'd go hunting, but he was constantly trying to turn his hunting trips into expeditions. He was writing notes, he was labeling his specimens, he was donating them to museums. Yeah, some of them he hung, on the wall as trophy heads, but people don't realize that even after abandoning his natural history ambitions, he was still very much a naturalist. My famous anecdote, and the book is full of just anecdotes of one of my favorites is when he was actually president of the United States. It's the only example that I'm aware of where a sitting president, he was actually president of the United States at the time, and he was with John Burroughs, and he was touring Yellowstone National Park in winter, and he was in this sleigh, this horse-drawn sleigh. And they were touring the Geyser region, and Roosevelt saw something out of the corner of his eye, and he jumped off that sleigh and went scurrying through the snow and took his hat and grabbed something, captured it, and it was a little vole. It was just a little rodent. And he euthanized it, and he went back to his, naturalist skills that he learned, his taxidermy that he learned as a child. And he prepared a museum study skin, and he said, yeah, I'm going to send this to the Smithsonian. I think it's pretty important. And you know what? That specimen is still there. It's still a perfectly good scientific specimen. You know what's even more interesting is, of course, it's stored with the voles, and then just a few drawers down is another vole that was collected by Teddy Roosevelt 40 years earlier from Massachusetts when he was something like 12 years old. So spanning 40 years from boyhood all through his life, the man remained resolutely, unequivocally this kind of naturalist. So the book is a story on one level, on a surface level. It's the story of one man's determination to finally become the intrepid kind of museum naturalist that he always wanted to be. And it's told in 3 parts. Part 1 is just, I really had a lot of fun writing it because so much of it I could relate to. But part 1 covers his years, when his ambition and his interest was pure. When he was studying taxidermy, the family would go on vacations. They'd go to Europe, and you read his diaries, and it's like, okay, we went to a cafe, and then I went to the bird market, like in Paris, and I bought all of these partridges and quails, and I went back to the hotel, and I skinned them, and I took my notes, and I made specimens, and it's just like Teddy, every single day, he didn't do it on Sunday, but then Monday, he was right back at it. There are descriptions of him landing in Liverpool and getting off the ship and running around trying to find some arsenic. He forgot his arsenic. I need it to preserve my skins. The family took a vacation in Egypt when he was a young teenager, and he was allowed to bring his shotgun along. And every day, the guy was obsessed every day collecting specimens, to the point where his sister said, you know what? Every time you come in the room, I hear the word bird and I hear the word skin. And she just said his passion was so strong in that regard. The second part of the book covers those stages where he, quote unquote, abandoned his natural history, and where he so-called was being a politician and snapping at the fringes of being a naturalist. And then the third part of the book is when he left the White House. And the few years, the last 2 years of his presidency, you read his letters and they're all to other naturalists, and he's just itching to get out onto an expedition. And what does he do? Within weeks of leaving the White House, he leads, it's something he organized, the Smithsonian African Expedition, which is 11 months in the field in Africa, invited a team of naturalists along, invited, writers, photographers, the whole thing. And it was a real expedition that went out and did the work that he always wanted to do all of his life. And so for me, you could read the book on that level. I think it's an inspiring story of how if you have a passion, whatever it is, whether it's natural history or whether it's something else, how if you stick with it, you could always go back to it and you could do it. Teddy did it after spending a whole life, in politics. But at the same time, it tells a much, much deeper story, I think. I think there's kind of an enigma around. Since writing the book, it's been out not even 2 weeks, and I've just been inundated with comments that like span like really positive to like, whoa, I didn't know this about Teddy Roosevelt. What are you talking about? And to me, that just highlights the fact that there has always been an enigma around Roosevelt. Here's this guy that was such an avid hunter and an avid, he killed a lot of animals, but at the same time, he's someone that led our conservation movement. And, again, like I said, if we didn't have Theodore Roosevelt, it's not a foregone conclusion that we would have national parks or quite as many as we have now. And so there's that enigma, how could he be one thing and how could he also be the other thing? And people have been talking about this for years, and every time, knowing what I know about Roosevelt now, every time I read about that or see that, it's obvious. There's no enigma. He was a museum naturalist. I mean, the work that I do, the work that we do, is very much like this, and it's important. And it's work that is rooted. Like I said, I grew up in New York. I understood what it was like to not have access to nature. Had I grown up someplace where I could walk out my back door and have beautiful nature and could wander through it, I wouldn't have turned out the way that I turned out. I got interested in museums because nature was something that was not something I took for granted, and it was not something that was easy to get to, and it was not something that was very attainable. And my instinct was to collect specimens so that I could have them. Very few summers did my family go to upstate New York where I could be in nature, and I had to make the best of that time. I had to make the absolute best of that time, and I was just trying to collect everything from fossils to feathers to birds to mammals to fish to snakes, and making my museum because that would sustain me through the rest of the year in a nature-devoid city. And I think the instincts of someone that comes from this background, it's the instincts of someone that doesn't take nature for granted. It's the instincts of someone that knows that it may not always be there. Maybe it'll be there, but maybe you can't get to it. As an adolescent, Roosevelt started going out west, and when he first started going out west, he was a brazen hunter, and I talk about it in the book. He was just shooting stuff with no regard. But it was only when he teamed up with a guy named George Bird Grinnell, who was a curator at the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History, that he really started to appreciate that, hey, extinction was not something that people believed in back then. They didn't think it was possible. What are you talking about? It could go extinct. That's crazy. People just didn't believe in extinction. It was only after Roosevelt started working with a paleontologist that had studied fossils out west, who was also a hunter. Together, Grinnell and Roosevelt founded the Boone and Crockett Club many years later. But it was Grinnell who opened his eyes to the fact that, nothing is forever, and things do go extinct. And what's interesting is when Roosevelt first went out west as a young man and as a hunter, he was looking around, he's like, look at all this game everywhere, there's animals everywhere. Well, not to Grinnell, because Grinnell had been there for the past, decade and a half. And Roosevelt was looking at it with fresh eyes, and from his perspective, game was there in abundance. But as he kept going back year after year, he realized, hey, the numbers are going down. And sure, they're going down because people are shooting them, but they're also going down because land is being lost and being converted to agriculture. And so, again, it gets back to this mentality of, and this sort of proclivity and ethic of viewing nature as something that can't be taken for granted, that may not always be there forever. And so I think you could read the book on another level, which is that when Roosevelt was setting aside national parks, he was setting them aside, think of them as outdoor museums of natural history. That's the way you could think about it. And just as he recognized that he wanted to save specimens for the future, he also wanted to save land where animals can live alive. Roosevelt, when he went on the Smithsonian African expedition, he was adamant that he was going to collect. Collect is the word we use for capture and make a specimen of. It's not a euphemism. It's collect because it's being added to a collection. And he said, there's this thing, it's called a northern white rhino. 105 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt predicted that they were going to go extinct and that there was nothing we could do about it, because he recognized as a naturalist that they needed far too much land, that the land that they occupied was so good for agriculture, there were so many people there, that they would never survive. And he said, you know what, I'm going to collect specimens because it seems almost certain that this thing is going to go extinct. And he collected specimens. And you know who his biggest critics were? His biggest critics, vocal critics, were all of the European big game hunters, all of the elite aristocratic European big game hunters. And they said, why are you taking so many of these, white rhinos? Save some for the rest of us so we could put one. We should each just get one to put on our wall. And he said, no, I'm going to collect these and I'm going to put them in a museum so people can see exhibits, and I'm going to put them in a museum so scientists at least can have material to study in the future. And that's exactly what he did, and that's exactly what we have. And the northern white rhino is now down to three zoo animals as of this year. And it's not going to survive. It's going to go extinct. So you could read it on, multiple levels, but I want to leave you with this thought. Roosevelt may have set aside national parks when he was a politician, but he didn't set aside national parks as a politician. He set aside national parks as a naturalist. And given all that Roosevelt accomplished, I think we owe it to him to have a better understanding of exactly what kind of naturalist he was, and that was a museum naturalist. And so with that, I think that's about a half hour I talked, right? I could open it up for questions.
So if you have questions, if you'd like to please come up to the microphones to ask those.
Yeah.
He did. He did.
Yeah, he did that too. When he went to Africa, he brought back a select number of animals for zoos. He did that as well. Not as much. Not as much. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you feel about our penchant as a species for confining animals in unnatural environments for our amusement and entertainment? Of course, I'm talking about zoos.
How do I feel about zoos? I think it makes people feel good because the animal is still alive, but I think, so when I'm not in the field, when I'm not on expeditions, what I do, my job is to manage a collection of specimens. And so Smithsonian has a few 100,000 mammal specimens that were collected over the past 200 years by various expeditions that went out, including expeditions that I was on, including expeditions that Teddy was on, and any number of other people, and including a lot of specimens that came from zoos. So what people don't realize is animals from zoos have some of the most hideous osteopathologies because the diet isn't right, they're not getting the same exercise. You look at these things and they have all kinds of deformed bones and all kinds of abnormal growth. I think it's an interesting question because I get that a lot, where I sleep well at night. I'm very happy with the work that I do. I understand that not everyone can do the work that I do, but I understand that it's important, that the work that I do directly feeds into conservation, and that the animals that I collect may not be volunteers, but if you want to know something, if you want to have an informed view of what's really going on out there in nature, you do need a certain number of specimens. I think zoos make people feel good, and they're useful in giving people an opportunity to see real animals. I wish zoos were, my vision of a zoo would be something that you'd have to work to see an animal, because when I go in the field, I really have to work hard and like march, climb mountains with backpacks. Maybe once a week I'll see like a real spectacular animal. My ideal of a zoo would be like some mountain where you could go and we could say, yeah, there's some elephant on that mountain, but you're going to have to walk around to see and kind of replicate. You know, it's never going to happen. But that's a convoluted answer to your question.
Yes.
They're discovered all the time. So in all museums. So the naturalists that work in museums are in the business of, it's not a business, we don't make money at it really, but our science is to explore and discover and describe at the most basic level species diversity. And so we discover things by, and I've discovered a lot of things by going out, and it's really wonderful when you're out there. And most of the stuff that I collect, I mean, we're not collecting elephants and rhinos, we're collecting rodents, you know, mostly, because that's what's not known. All of the big stuff is pretty well known. That was done in Teddy's day. What's being done now is when I say I'm up there shooting things, I'm shooting little mice out of the tops of the trees, and, you know, they come down and I describe them, and we get a disease profile, and we, you know, take DNA samples and we put it in jars, but it's roughly similar to what Roosevelt did on a much, much less intensive scale. But you'll find them in any museum. You'll find these naturalists at Field Museum in Chicago, and American Museum in New York, Smithsonian in Washington, even university museums are going out. And it's the other place we find them is actually in the museum itself. And so things that were collected on past expeditions, but they weren't really studied in detail. And so you don't even have to leave a major city. You could go into the collections of a museum, and if you know what you're doing, you could find stuff and you could describe things. We loan them constantly. So, you know, I loan hundreds and hundreds of specimens to different colleagues in different museums every year. And visitors come to museums and they come to study collections. And Roosevelt did that in his lifetime. He visited all of the museums. In fact, there were records of museum curators being astounded that they would lay out, you know, like collections of like obscure rodents, and Roosevelt would just go down the line, pick it up, and give the Latin name, and just, this is a this is a that, this is a that. It was really a marvel.
What was his vote at Roosevelt's most exotic specimen?
Roosevelt's most exotic. I don't know how to define exotic. But probably, well, I would say that his most important collection, and it's not, I get asked this all the time, what's my favorite mammal? I don't have a favorite. It's kind of similar to that, I guess. I'm not trying to, you know, it's a tough question, but I think his most important collection was the collection that he made in Kenya as part of the Smithsonian African expedition. There was another expedition that he did. So my book ends with the Smithsonian African expedition, and it ends with that for a reason, because it's the story of a man's early introduction to and his fascination with natural history and his lifelong quest to become exactly the kind of naturalist that he wanted to become. He achieved that with the Smithsonian African expedition, you know, in bucket loads. He later went on and did other expeditions. He did the River of Doubt for the American Museum of Natural History. I didn't really cover that in my book because my story was told. You know, I told the story, and he had achieved this, and he returned to New York triumphant. He did it. It took him a lifetime, but he did it. And in many ways, his South American expedition was kind of a failure. Not a failure, but a real tragedy. People died, and there were murders and drownings, and he almost died. And if it weren't for his son, he was just telling people to leave him beyond, go on without me. It was just a real, and many books have been written about it. So, but yeah, he collected a lot of, maybe the tapirs he collected in South America. Some South American scientists just described them as something new, just a couple of years ago. So, yes. Wow, so again, the South American expedition, Rondon was the explorer and the guide. I think he was just really tough. I've worked with guys like that. He's just like some of these guys, they're not built like me for sure. They're just really tough. Well, he was a native himself. I mean, he was, so I think he was spot on. I think he had to be that way. I mean, it's tough decisions sometimes, but yeah. Rightly so. Yeah.
Yes, I know you all have heard of this guy, but I studied under John Morton Blum.
Okay.
He's one of the world's greatest authorities on Theodore Roosevelt.
Right.
I studied that.
Okay.
And also, he was one of the world's greatest authorities on Woodrow Wilson. Two entirely different people.
Right.
Okay. My question is, I'm very interested in what you have to say today about the particularities of the natural resources, and a lot of it I didn't get from him,
Right.
but we all know about some of it. What I would like to ask of you is something that seems, just from you knowing about Teddy Roosevelt, not having to do particularly with natural resources.
Right.
Would he have been for the war in Vietnam?
Wow. Wasn't expecting that. He was. But I'm glad you brought that up. Let me try to field that. I will say that when diplomatic relations were normalized with Vietnam before it was open for tourists, that I was part of the first teams that went in with the American Museum of Natural History, and we went in the middle and late 90s to. I mean, the Russians certainly didn't do anything for national parks when they were there. And when it opened, there was a 2-3 year period before it opened to tourists where there was foreign exchange. And foreign exchange isn't just a check, it's not just money, it's also advisors and naturalists. And we went and we worked with Vietnamese colleagues, and we explored their forests and identified and actually gazetted lands that were then set aside. It was one of the conditions of normalization of relations with Vietnam. I know this isn't answering your question, and I'm buying myself some time, actually. But that was one of the conditions of our working, normalizing relations, is that they will set aside national parks. And that's a legacy of Roosevelt. And we went, and the way we decided, I mean, we couldn't, it's just a pipe dream to think that you could go and this, some land has to be logged. Some land has to be used for people. And the work that we do is we go in and we do the tough work, and we do the surveys, we do the inventory, we collect the specimens, we document what's there. We find where the national park should be and where maybe we don't need a national park here because there's nothing but radish here. We're the people that do that. Would Roosevelt be for the war? I don't know, but I would say that he would definitely have a strong opinion about it one way or the other. That's as far as I would go. All right.
I'm sure that's
Was there another question? Yeah.
Mr. Lunde, what do you think people such as myself, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room, what do you think backyard naturalists that feed the birds and
I think
care
that's
about
great.
the environment can do to make a difference?
So, you know, I'm here to, part of the reason why I wrote the book is I felt, you know, Roosevelt was very honest in everything that he did, and he was very honest about making tough choices and about doing difficult things. And his thing was to view nature without sentiment and without, he had a great expression. He said, you know, soundness of head, not softness of heart. You know, that's what motivated his conservation decisions. And so, you know, we tend to kind of want to not think about, there's some touchy stuff in the book, you know, and I confronted head on, and I confronted it head on because Roosevelt would have confronted it head on. He was not shy, and he said what he wanted to say, even when people didn't want to hear it, and I respect that and I admire that. And so I'll tell just this group, you know, a lot of what I wrote in the book, I wrote saying, you know, Teddy would approve of me, you know, really going into the gory details. But that's not to say that I'm saying we should all pick up our butterfly nets and go start building collections of butterflies with insect pens. That's not what I'm saying. I think, you know, things have changed in the last 100 years, and we all can't do that. And I think people relate to nature, and Roosevelt, I have a bird feeder, you know, in my backyard, and I think anything that gets you closer to nature, anything that brings nature in close. You know, one of the things I say about Roosevelt is he created the national parks because he wanted us to have space to be naturalists. Think about that. You actually need space to be a proper naturalist. You need a lot of space, a lot of natural space. You can't properly be a naturalist in a dark, gloomy, windowless room like his father's library. That's something entirely different. And I think one of the ways we create spaces is by bringing wildlife into us. So I think that's all great. And I think Teddy he was an avid birder, and I talk just as much about that in the book too. Connecting all the parts. Oh, the parks. Corridors, where you can, it's good. Yeah, corridors is good because the species, one of the big things is, you know, you need a park that's big enough to sustain the species. So if you could connect them, you allow one to, you know, they could move between them. But they move between them anyway, unless even if it's, that there's this puma that's, you know, running all over North America, you know, ending up in Connecticut. I'm sure you've heard about it. But I think in general, it's a good idea to try to connect them.
Where should we be going with our conservation efforts?
Wow, okay. I think, don't get me started, but I think where we should be going is conservation. Roosevelt this is an entirely different subject, but Roosevelt would be absolutely apoplectic if he saw what happened to the conservation movement that he largely built. It's bogged down in legalism, it's lawyers, it's litigation, it's, you know, vast sums of money are spent not studying animals, they're spent dealing with legal things that need to be dealt with. It's just a complete mess. It just needs to be, if it can be done, people need to dismantle what they can, and I don't want to say start over, but I'll start with that. I think another thing we need to do is we have a lot of land that's set aside, but it could be managed better, and it's related to the first part of my answer is you know, a lot of the decisions are made, they're not made because that's what the best science supports. They're made because we're boxed into some legal bind. And the people that work for Fish and Wildlife are like heartbroken. They're like, why am I doing this? This makes no sense. But that's largely what it's become. So, yes?
What is the real story about Teddy Bear?
Oh boy. I don't really cover that in my book, but to a certain extent I do. Not the teddy bear itself, but you know the story. He was on a bear hunt in Mississippi, and on the Sunflower River. And the guide, they called him away. He wanted to be there. You know, they were tracking bear with dogs. And so to make a long story short, they had captured a bear at a time when they said, you got to come back and have lunch. I mean, and for some reason, Teddy said, okay, I'll have the picnic lunch. And then the bear came and they tied it up. It was just an unethical scene that he totally disapproved of and said that this is unsportsmanlike, this is unethical, I'll have no part of it. And he just, you know, in his own way extracted himself from a really tricky situation. And it was spun politically, but the teddy bear, he ended up being real popular for his decision. You know, I mean, he made the right move. I mean, when he was a very young man just getting into hunting, he was unethical. I wouldn't say unethical, but I think he didn't have the ethics that he developed later on in life. And then he made it almost like a religion to be ethical about hunting. And so he was adamant about, if you're going to do this, you're going to do it a proper way. So that's the bear was kind of like a celebration of his choice to do things the right way. Yeah.
I had a question. I appreciate Teddy Roosevelt and his work on our national parks here in the United States. My concern is that there are record numbers of visitors that are going into all of our national parks. Is there going to come a point when that's not sustainable, that the animals or the parks themselves will suffer because so many of us are visiting and want to see nature?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we may actually already be there where it's a problem. I mean, how to answer that one? I think it's a thorny issue, and I think the solution is going to be in you know, carefully managing what areas people get to go into and what are the areas, you know, having areas that are like wilderness areas where it's not easy to get into it and where, you know, access is, I wouldn't want to say restricted, but certainly not. I know what you're saying, and it's a tough thing because people need access to the parks, and it's just, I think on a case-by-case basis, it really depends on the individual park and what's going on there, and I think management decisions need to be, there's no blanket solution. I think those management decisions need to be made on site, case by case, and based on the best scientific evidence available. And they need to listen to the people that actually work in those parks, that actually know what's going on, and that doesn't always happen.
Okay, thank you.
Yes?
Are there, in your view, parts of the world, most parts of the world that haven't been sufficiently explored by naturalists?
Yes, absolutely. I know exactly where they are. I look at a map every day and I just dream about the places. It's not hard. They're areas that have, they're usually border regions, and they're usually regions that have had a lot of conflict, right? They're usually mountain. So the areas that have a lot of undescribed diversity are areas that have historically, that support a lot of biodiversity in the first place, okay? And these tend to be very complex habitats, and habitats in the tropics. So as you move towards the poles, you get fewer, it's just a general principle, you get fewer species, but you get many more of them. Think of millions and millions of lemmings in the Arctic. And then as you get into the tropics, you get many more species, the same amount of biomass, but you just get a greater diversity of species. The habitats are just much more complex in the tropics. So it's in the band of the tropics, and it's in areas where there's a lot of complexity to the topography. And then if you could combine that with areas that are remote, war-torn, difficult to get into, and full of disease, you know, South Sudan, Myanmar, Congo, you know, Central African Republic, all of the places where I work. You know, like I tell my parents, I've been, you know, nobody knows anything about museum naturalists. I've been doing this for, you know, more than 26 years, and I describe what my work is, and they said, yeah, but really, what do you do? I'm like, no, I'm going to South Sudan, we're going to net these bats, and we're going to test them for Ebola, and we're going to put them in jars of alcohol, and we're going to take them back. That's my job, museum naturalist. But, you know, that's what we do, and those are the areas. And I think we're reaching the point where we're never going to find everything. You know, I talk about it in the book where museum naturalists are an endangered species, and where, you know, well, I say that, you know, I mean, and I say just like Roosevelt predicted that the white rhino would inevitably slowly go extinct, I say in the same vein, us museum naturalists, we're going to slowly go extinct. And the reason is because people's sentiments are changing. You know, one of the reasons why I wrote the book is I think it's really important to understand the brand of naturalism. Naturalism was so important to Roosevelt's personality, to his persona. And nobody really has a firm grasp. That's why there's the enigma of Roosevelt. Nobody really knows what a museum naturalist is. And so I wrote the book because I wanted to benchmark that. I wanted to describe that. I wanted to get it on record. This is what it is. This is what he was doing. This is what he wanted to be. Because the further we get down through the future, the further we're going to get away from that. You know, I mean, people aren't going to, there won't be any of us left, and people just won't know what those things are. So I think people's perception of what a naturalist is, it evolves, it changes. It was different in Roosevelt's day, it's different today, it's going to be different in the future. And those of us that are left going on these expeditions and discovering and describing things, it's a race against time. And it's a race against time not just because habitats are being destroyed, it's a race against time because, you know, we know it's just like maybe another decade before public sentiment is like, you know what, we just don't want people doing, it's not important finding all of these species. We'd rather be ignorant than have people going out, and that's probably going to happen. I'll get your question too. The funds can be raised through, it's usually, all of my expeditions are through partnerships, and so South Sudan is in partnership with CDC, Centers for Disease Control, from private donors, private funders. Usually it's a mishmash of a lot of different things. Because I work for the Smithsonian, I'm not eligible for applying for NSF money. Right? Because we're government, we can't apply for government money. It's a conflict of interest. So it's one of the ironies. You know, you work for the government or quasi-government, you've got to go out there and find private sources. But we partner with stakeholders that have interests in conservation, you know, that benefit from the work that we do. I'm going to give priority to people that are at the mic. So, okay. Sorry.
Do you have a reflection, perhaps, of how John Muir influenced Teddy, or how Teddy might have influenced John Muir?
Oh, that's interesting, how Teddy influenced John Muir. They certainly influenced each other. They were very, very different. John Muir was, I don't know if anyone would mind my calling him kind of a mystic. I think Roosevelt had a very friendly respect for John Muir, and I think he could relate to a lot of the things. People would be surprised, but I think Roosevelt was a very poetic kind of guy, and he could really relate to nature for its beauty. But at the same time, Roosevelt had his, you know, brass tacks agendas too, you know, and he said it's, you know, we also need to do this other stuff. You know, he has a famous line saying it may not be possible to save big cats like lions and tigers for mere sentimental reasons. That's a quote from Roosevelt. I paraphrase, but he just said, I share these sentiments, but we may need a little bit more if we want to save these. How Roosevelt influenced John Muir, wow, I'd like to read that book. I don't know. I think I haven't gotten that much into John Muir, but that's a real interesting question. Yes?
You talked about mammals and you touched on birds.
Yeah.
And insects. What about fish? That are part of the animal?
Okay. So a real question about museums and what Roosevelt did, what I do, what we all do, how these things are preserved. Let's start with mammals, which is my specialization. You could preserve any animal by injecting it with formaldehyde and storing it in alcohol. Insects you could dry on pins. Mammals you could save as what's called a study skin. So it's taxidermy, but it's not taxidermy like this. It's taxidermy so that you could see, you know, it's so that you could put them in drawers and you could stack many of them in there neatly and efficiently so that you could look at a whole series of them together. It's skeletons, it's skulls. Increasingly, when I got in this business, we never took DNA samples. Now I can't collect a specimen without not only taking a DNA sample, it's like most of my time is spent there's like a long list of, like, usually when I go on an expedition, there's like a dozen people. Oh, can you get this? Can you get that? Can you get swabs of this? Can you get blood smears? Can you get a thick smear? Can you get, I'm like, yeah, I'm becoming one of those technicians that Roosevelt was talking about. But we do it, you know, and we collect these, and then we send the various parts, parasites and blood and tissue and stomach contents, and they all go off to different naturalists and scientists that study them. Fish go in jars of alcohol, or they could be skeletons, or, you know, the idea is just to preserve the anatomical parts, because a picture is only so good, and not very good, actually. And there are ways that specimens in museums are being used in ways now that no one could have ever predicted. I mean, when most of the specimens were collected, Smithsonian has 600,000 mammal specimens that I'm responsible for the upkeep of. They were collected over the span of 200 years from expeditions all over the world. Most of those were collected before anyone knew what DNA was. But now, we could go to every one of those specimens. Every one of those specimens has a tag telling you exactly where it came from and exactly when it was collected. And every one of those specimens has not only DNA samples, but all kinds of other chemical signatures on it. It's a tremendous resource. 600,000 sounds like a lot. But what I tell people is, do you know how many animals are killed on, estimated, average number of animals killed on United States roads every year? 600,000 is the number. So every year, 600,000 animals are killed on roads, and of no benefit to science. They just rot. So I don't think 600 is a big number. I think there are, when I look at my collection, I see the gaps. I see what's missing. I don't see volume. I see what I don't have. Yeah.
Are there any scientists interested in who are wanting to, say, collect extinct animal DNA, perhaps with the notion of beginning to figure out how to recreate that?
Right.
Extinct species.
They call it.
Maybe 50 years down.
It's hard to say. It's most certainly not possible now. So it's called ancient DNA when they go in and they pull DNA out of something that's extinct. There are a couple of problems here. Is DNA is only part of what you need to do that. So we could clone, you know, could do whole genome. I mean, you hear about in the news like Dolly the sheep and, you know, cloning these dogs and stuff. But those are all species that are not extinct, okay? So it's not just a matter of having the DNA, but these organisms need to develop, you know, like inside an actual animal. So you could get the DNA of a woolly mammoth, but we don't have any woolly mammoths. You could get it to the 16-cell stage. But what am I going to do with this? You know, you can't take it any further than that. I'm not going to say we can't get to that, but it's a significant challenge, development, and it's one that. And so, you know, you hear in the news, and, you know, it depends on, you know, how. It really gets down to science education. I mean, sometimes I see stuff on the news and it's like, ooh, they're really trying to make it seem like we could do that, but we really can't. You know, it's we're not quite ready for Jurassic Park. Yeah. Yes.
Do you see evidence of environmental change from Roosevelt's day and before and today?
Direct evidence of environmental change?
In the specimens, do you see environmental
Sure.
evidence?
So, like I was saying, and I should preface this by saying that I wrote the book in my spare time. You know, it's just something I did. It's not part of my official work at the Smithsonian, but by coincidence, and maybe not a coincidence, I mean, Roosevelt is just a very popular figure. We also have a program at the Smithsonian where, of course, all of the specimens from the Smithsonian Roosevelt expedition are there. And so just a few months ago, I and a team of us returned from an expedition to Mount Kenya. And so 106 years ago now, Roosevelt's naturalist, Roosevelt himself didn't go up. He collected an elephant, he shot an elephant, and he did some other things. And then he left the Smithsonian naturalists there. And they did what's called a transect. And so they, over months, or rather weeks, they worked their way up the mountain and they collected at each elevation to document how the different species change as you go up Mount Kenya, which goes up to, you know, over 5,000 meters, 15,000 feet. It's a big mountain. So we went back to some of those because we had the original photographs, and we were able to find some of the original camps with the same rock formations and camp right there, and repeat that collection. It's drastically different. I mean, not only is it different in terms of species, but you go to places where, you know, the Roosevelt expedition, they were glaciers, you know, and they were talking about, you know, walking on the ice. Well, there's no glaciers there now. But the species change, you know, they don't change, the composition changes, the whole ecology of the mountain changes, and has implications for, you know, lots of things. I mean, a lot of what we do as museum scientists, we do because we're interested in it, but ultimately a lot of it has real bearing on real things that affect people. I mean, one example is just disease ecology in Kenya. I mean, basically what's happened is a lot of the larger mammals have been removed, or their populations are way down, and what you see is an increase in rodents. Because you still have the same amount of food on the mountain. So instead of having big ungulates and big herbivores munching down this grass, you've got all of these rodents, and then your disease, you know, profile goes up, and that's just like science. That's what we do. But yeah. But you definitely see a change, and there's a lot more of these studies going on now, change with time, looking at old expeditions and doing new expeditions.
Lewis and Clark expedition, Roosevelt. Do you know that he studied or read any of that material?
Well, the
to
Lewis
guide
and
him?
Clark, much earlier, a lot of that is what survives from that expedition is in the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences.
Oh,
there are some specimens, mostly plant specimens. Some of them made their way into the Smithsonian. They kind of move around. That was a very early expedition, and a lot of those specimens were sadly lost because we didn't have museums. We didn't have a lot of these 1860s, 1870s, you know, is when we got our big natural history museums. Prior to that, it was just kind of, museums were just kind of getting started. And so I know Thomas Jefferson had like a lot of those, and he's our other naturalist president. There's Roosevelt, and there's, you know, Thomas Jefferson was a paleontologist and described stuff. Unless there's like one burning question, I would just finish by saying it's a very different kind of book. I had a lot of fun writing it. I think it's a side of Roosevelt that just hasn't been written about anywhere, and it's a side of Roosevelt that, again, like I said, I think it's really important. He did these things as a naturalist. He didn't create the national parks as a politician. Some of us were talking earlier on. It's like, you've got to have an interest in something to legislate something. You know, a politician that's a career politician is just not going to have the motivation to do the things that Roosevelt did. And all of these things that he did, the national parks there, and everything from ethical hunting to national parks to even the specimens he added to museums, all of it. He did it as a naturalist, and he did it as a museum naturalist, and I think his accomplishments are substantial, and I think we kind of owe it to him to understand, you know, who he was as a naturalist, and that's what the book is about. So I'm told I'm to dash to the back of the room.
Thank you.
But thank you.
This has been a Metro TV production.